The Energy of Abundance, Practical Advice and Spiritual Wisdom to Achieve Anything You Want in Life. Chapter 6, Time. Mario Benedetti said, 5 minutes is enough to dream a whole life. That's how relative time is. So one of the most common things I hear from clients trying to expand their life in some way is, I ran out of time. I just don't have enough time, or I can't make time for myself right now. Something else has come up. So there's always a version of not enough time, or that something else is more important than what it is they say they want. And this is the crux of this first part of the chapter, that we do not allow in that which we say we want. And we push it out through limiting beliefs. And the programming that we have in our mind sets the tone and sets the parameters for what gets in and when. So, not enough time. I can't make time for myself right now. Something else has come up. When that is an ongoing theme, something outside of us is running our schedule. We're not in the driver's seat. We're not allowing. And we're operating on a belief of limitation. And we find these sneaky little thoughts in I have to statements or I should statements. Now, in day-to-day life, of course, we all have jobs. We're accountable to employers, various relationships in our lives. But this idea that somehow we can't or shouldn't make room for things that matter to us is at the core of a creative, manifestive schism. I mean, this is what causes us to be poor receivers. Because if we can't say yes to ourselves, even though the divine always says yes, we're not going to be able to receive. We don't allow in the very things we say we want. And it can be challenging because when we hit up against our limiting beliefs and those shoulds and those have tos, it can be scary, and it challenges us to confront many things in our lives that we may not want to confront. Now, of course, what most of us are looking for is happiness. But happiness is an inner game. And there's no way around learning how to have a healthy relationship with our inner world. Most of us spend time trying to talk ourselves out of what our inner world is saying and manage the external world. That's the cart before the horse. The whole manifesting game, the whole happiness game is about our relationship to ourselves and greater consciousness. And this is what quantum physics refers to when suggesting that our observations influence our experiences on a tangible matter. What we observe and then conclude about life shapes our experiences. It's going to shape what we receive, what comes to us. But when we can master that inner narrative and learn how to deal with the limitations, the inner narrative cycles around and around in our brain, and the resistance to the discomfort that comes up when we want to extricate ourselves from that, we'll be happy much more. We will find happiness. And those things that happen externally in our life will not diminish our happiness. Doesn't mean we won't have challenges or hardships that occur, but how we view them and how we feel in the day-to-day is going to be significantly different. This may sound like an oversimplification, but we can choose to be joyful or happy at any time, because suffering is resistance in some form to the present moment. And as we sit in our present moment and have that exchange, that process with ourselves, where we put context to our inner narrative and heal or progress ourselves, we learn to surrender. And then suffering goes away. Now, for different challenges in life and different experiences, it can be more difficult, but that's what expansion is about. Expansion is expanding. It causes us to become more. And expansion, it's an action word. It's not a sitting still word waiting for something to change outside of ourselves. It's an active process as of us being awake and engaged in our life to solve and become more. And in the formula of receiving, allowing, attracting, we have to learn to honor natural rhythms. We get stuck on the timing. And when the timing doesn't meet what our mind tells us it should, we throw a fit internally, or we're going to give up on the thing that we say we want to manifest, rather than doing the inner process to put context around the moment we are in and surrender to the wisdom of a higher consciousness, because at the end of the day, it's always a collaboration and we are the junior partner. So often when we don't get what we want in the time frame that we want, we can begin a cycle of less than scarcity, sort of a victimization approach toward how life is working for you. And we begin self-abandoning. And so as we're creative beings, creating all the time. And when we set off on a course of manifestation, abundance of any sort, from a position of self-abandonment, you know where I'm going with this. That is the foundation of our creative process. It can only take us so far. And this is why achievement seeking leaves us empty. We can run ourselves ragged trying to please, achieve, make things happen as a way to feeling good, but it doesn't solve that inner conflict. It doesn't resolve that feeling of purposefulness and worthiness and surrender. So here's a story about a great client I have. Names are changed, of course, named Jessica. She has been with me off and on for about 4 years. And when she started, she was in her late 30s, and she is very knowledgeable about spirituality, extremely bright, but she does embody the classic definition of a superachiever. She fulfills a demanding role in the corporate world. And when we first began working together, she was trying to determine whether to parent either through pregnancy or adoption. And this was a contentious issue on many levels in her life. She had some physical issues, which made it arduous. And there was some question about whether her husband was really that interested in having children. We worked together for a period of time while she sorted through this potent issue. At the beginning of our time together, Jessica had a difficult time acknowledging her right to have needs. She wasn't sure she was allowed to have needs or if they should influence her decisions. In life, she often deferred to her husband or the loudest voice in the room to avoid conflict. So the decision to parent or not to parent was huge for her. Jessica wasn't sure she had the right to declare her needs to be a mother. She didn't know if she had the right to spend money on treatments to realize pregnancy or adoption. So she was right in the throes of trying to understand and balance her needs with the needs of her husband and the marriage. So she was very much in conflict and at the same time beginning to make waves in her marriage, which is something she had never done before. True to her analytical nature, we looked at all the pros and cons of her situation logically, but in matters of the heart, with those things that make us happy, there is no logic. It just is. You know, and Jessica was very afraid of the repercussions to her marriage, to make a decision to be pregnant. So with full awareness of her options, Jessica stopped seeing me for a time to integrate her choice. After about 2 years, Jessica returned to me with a new goal, but the same goal. And in that time away, she had decided not to become a parent. After considering the repercussions to her marriage, she opted out. However, she did move her elderly mother and aunt into her house to care for them. I found it fascinating that she became a caregiver to her mother and aunt, not to a child. So she filled that need in some way. She was still able to maintain her role in her full-time corporate job and keep pace in her marriage. But when she returned to restart coaching, it was stated as needing to turn her attention onto herself. It was a similar goal for different reasons. She was still trying to find out how she could get her own needs met in her own life. She even stated, it's time to turn the attention to myself. So as we began to talk about her reasons for returning to coaching, it was as if I was talking to two people at one time. Her essence and her ego were completely at polar opposites, not integrated at all. She was nearly out of her body, sharing her thoughts from an analytical perspective, as if she were talking about someone else. There was no emotion present, and it became even more pronounced as she began to talk about her deep sense of sadness from both running herself ragged, trying to prove her worth, and not pursuing parenting. It was clear that what she was doing wasn't working for her, and she couldn't stop the behaviors. But it was a new version of the same conflict. Did she have a right to have her feelings or express them? You know, her feelings didn't line up on the spreadsheet of her life plan. You know, but that's the way it was. And somehow she had to make peace with it. But she was very sad, but not able to feel her sadness. And she could only talk about it as if it were someone else. So although she seemed to have made peace with her parenting choice, the internal conflict of, am I allowed to have my needs met, had transferred to a topic that was more palatable to the people in her life. There was no conflict with her husband about caring for her aging mother and aunt, or for her to take a class or do some coaching. Jessica's family also brought financial resources into the home, and her husband was very financially oriented. So she was in a safe and protected place to once again peel back the layers of her perspective. So typically when people are ready to feel differently, they want to begin feeling differently right away. So, but when Jessica and I spoke and set up a time to restart her sessions, she planned it 3 weeks in the future. You know, she had reasons for starting several weeks out, so I honored her rhythm. And the day before her appointment, I received an email saying her boss scheduled a last-minute meeting and she had to go into the office, so she needed to reschedule. So we did it for the following week, and I wondered if she was going to keep the appointment, because often these delay tactics mask a resistance to change and highlight an inability to put oneself first. Well, she did keep her appointment the following week, and I didn't bring up to her whether or not she had set her needs to the side in lieu of her boss's meeting or other things. I just tucked the thoughts away to watch what would happen next. In our first appointment, it didn't take long to get to her core issue of feeling a lack of permission to do what she needed to do for herself, and how she still feels she needs to earn approval from others to feel valuable in her life. She had created a momentum that she was unable to stop, even though she wanted to stop. Most everyone in her life had come to know her as the get it done person. She was the person who could manage anything, everything. She had essentially trained everyone in her life to expect enormous things from her and to be a giver in their life. Now, as she wanted to change that dynamic and begin to do less, she couldn't make it happen. And she even questioned if it were possible. I gave her an assignment to begin in small ways to make room for herself, such as to bring her spiritual principles into her daily life. So Jessica would spend an hour a day every night reading or listening to spiritual radio shows or doing some form of meditation. It was only for her in the privacy of her bedroom. And once she left that room, her spiritual principles disappeared. So we began to discuss this idea of living two lives, meaning a life that excluded the wealth of her spiritual awareness and why she did that. We wanted to discover how she could begin to integrate the principles she holds so dear into her everyday life. You know, why have a frame for navigating the life experience if you aren't going to apply it? So as she began to answer that question to herself, we kept finding our way back to, I don't deserve. I don't want to be judged. I want to be part of my tribe. So much of our work together was to help her bridge the gap, the fears, and the conditioning that said it has to be one way or the other. So Jessica also mentioned how down she was on herself about her weight. She felt she was overweight and criticized herself relentlessly. Again, another view of less than, because she believed she had extra weight on her body. And as a side note, often excess weight indicates we're holding on to energy that needs to be released, or there's anxiety that we're not addressing. So she was clearly holding on to the energy of I'm less than and not worthy, and really didn't know how to let it go. So I asked Jessica to consider how her extra weight served her, not why it was wrong in her life, but why it was right. I asked her to find meaning in why she allowed the extra weight, but also to acknowledge how her body consistently responded perfectly to her requests. I asked her to honor her body for being an amazing friend to her. I asked her to remind herself her body was doing what she was asking, and to cultivate a sense of appreciation for the perfection in that relationship. I encouraged her to honor her body, not put it down. And finally, I asked her to write about her inner beliefs, about why she didn't deserve to feel good about herself, and about how she has abandoned herself, and to forgive herself for that act. And this key to process is to recognize its value and honor. The key is to process its value and honor it. And this is true not just with body weight, but in anything that's going on in our lives that we don't like or that we think is wrong or bad. We want to flip the coin and ask ourselves, how is this serving me? Now, when Jessica was contemplating pregnancy, the idea of choosing what she wanted and allowing the rhythms to adjust around her were too vast. And it could have potentially signaled the end of her marriage, and that was simply too much for her. But in these circumstances, our choices were safe enough to her that she was able to begin a process. So I encouraged her to begin to use choose language rather than have to language. The energy of I choose to do this thing feels differently than I have to do this thing. And not just with Jessica, but with all of us. If we adopt that mentality, if I am choosing this, it's going to change our energy, that one statement alone. So the day before our next scheduled session, I received an email from Jessica. Once again, she indicated that work was coming in between her and our appointment. Then she indicated that with the holidays and other things, it would likely be 3 weeks before we could speak again. She proposed a date 3 weeks in the future, and I empower my clients to determine when they want to see me and what works for their schedule. However, this rescheduling was a little bit too coincidental for my comfort level of what I'd been observing. Because after a 2-week break, most people lose momentum and have to start all over again. So I felt I had to bring to her attention that it wasn't that she wasn't showing up for me, she wasn't showing up for herself. And so I even went as far as to give her a weekend option so that work wouldn't interfere with her schedule. Interestingly, after calling out the energy, Jessica agreed to make time in just 3 days. I didn't have to go any further with her self-abandoning. I just had to remind her what works in the process of change. And for her in particular, her linear mind put 2 and 2 together and she responded. As for Jessica and all people, we have to retrain ourselves. We are creatures of habit. And for Jessica, she absolutely wanted to change, but she was exhausted and she had so many habits in place that were unconscious. It just felt overwhelming to her. And change doesn't come naturally to any of us. We have to stay awake and engaged, and it can be scary and difficult and unnerving. And this is why support is so beneficial. Support is not a sign of weakness, it's a strategy for success. Because if we have a buddy, a coach, or someone who can remind us to stay awake to what matters to us, it helps. When Jessica and I spoke 3 days later, it was an amazing conversation. Her boss had essentially asked her to take on a number of projects for him. And rather than consent without thinking and pressing forward in an effort to please, as she would typically do, she elected to say nothing. And she went to the privacy of her office and decided to consider what would actually work for her in her life to maintain balance. So she realized she could take on 1 or 2 of the projects, but not all of them. And if she took on everything, she would become overwhelmed and once again have no room for herself. So then she noticed that a couple of the projects were not in her area of expertise, that they would require even more of her time and energy. So she crafted a strategy to explain to her boss why he should delegate the additional projects to a different department, as that department had a higher level of expertise than she did. So Jessica was able to give him a resource. At the same time, she was saying no. And no was not a word she was accustomed to using. So when she shared her process with me, it was fascinating to watch her resistance to her own process. On one hand, she was absolutely relieved to say no to the excessive work request, but on the other hand, she was terrified she may be rejected or condemned in some way. Her approach in the workplace environment had always been to do 110%, to go above and beyond what was asked. She became acutely aware that her insistence upon doing more than necessary was not about excellence or doing a good job. It was driven by a need to feel worthy and accepted. When she finally relayed her answer and suggestions to her boss, he accepted them. He didn't jump for joy, but that's okay. Jessica was creating balance and learning to honor herself. And in abundance work, this is how we invite abundance and allow it in. And these types of activities always bring us into alignment with our truest self and highest potential. We become so fearful of what we might lose, we reject what we might gain. The amazing Miguel Ruiz, author of The 4 Agreements, wrote, "Always do your best. This is one of the 4 agreements. Yet, doing your best is not doing more than you should and can in a given moment. If you are taking yourself out of balance, you're not doing your best." Jessica's awareness of her pattern of going out of balance, coupled with the fatigue of driving herself relentlessly, was forcing her to reach for change. It was not without discomfort. This was new territory for her. And even good new feelings can make us feel awkward. But Jessica was now inch by inch beginning to face the emptiness she felt inside and its causes. And that is the birthplace of true abundance and allowing abundance in and learning to receive from the universe. Now, let's talk about how we identify with time. So, of course, the human body is finite. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the physical world speaks to us in terms of a beginning, a middle, and an end. The ego and the physical world always wants to quantify, qualify, and measure everything to fit into the physical reality. And it's the way the ego mind comprehends this existence. But in true greater reality, time is an illusion. There is no time or space. Time is something the finite awareness uses to define itself. The essence, or our soul, is timeless and knows no limitation or boundary and needs no point of reference. It just is, always has been and always will be. And it's not so much about time to the soul as balance and alignment. So in the human experience, the more we can cease identification with experiences as good, bad, right, wrong, important, not important, then we stop the need to measure time and we focus on balance. And we become interested observers. And we see the value of our role in existence at a particular moment in life. You know, as I was writing this timepiece, I received a call from a dear friend, and she was telling me how her car engine had blown up. And she and her husband both ignored the signs the car had given them, including the check engine light. And now they were faced with having to buy a new car. And the car she was talking about was at least 10 years old, and it had enormous wear and tear. So, of course, I listened compassionately to my friend, but I couldn't help but notice all the adjectives she used to measure her experience. This is so terrible. This is not what I want to spend my money on right now. I don't want to deal with this. But this scenario beautifully illustrates how most of us react when something doesn't go the way we want it to go. We plan our lives and organize our lives to go a certain way. We set up simple and elaborate systems to implement the outcomes we want and to secure, as I call it, the plot of land under our feet so we can manage everything exactly how we want it. And we want to execute strategies for our perfect and benevolent life. Then life throws us a curve we hadn't factored into our process. And then in that, we have forgotten that we're part of something greater than ourselves. We can't control everything. Matter of fact, we can't control anything. It's really in how we learn to flow with life's curveballs that we find peace, how we learn to interact with greater reality. So I said to my friend lovingly, at least you have the money to spend on a car. She said, you're right. That's true. I just wanted to spend it on other things. You know, my friend was so frustrated in the moment. She wasn't able to grab the full bird's eye view and acknowledge that she had had 10 plus years of great service from her car. She had gone years without a car payment. But nothing lasts forever. And even in this mundane example, my friend had to work her way through her own resistance to modifying her plans. You know, and some of her resistance was about going into a dealership and facing the process of buying a car and all that entails. But then her husband did elect to take on that chore. So in a few days' time, she'll have a new car. And then she'll begin to remember all the flaws and problems that existed with the older car that she had overlooked because it suited her needs in the current moment. And she'll begin to see why having the new car is a beneficial thing for her. So this mundane situation illustrates a typical pattern most of us follow to varying degrees. We lament and resist life, but then eventually come to a place of acceptance. And if we're determined, we'll find happiness in our new circumstance. But the quicker we can navigate these cycles and go straight to acceptance and happiness, the more happiness we'll have. It's our resistance to our own discomfort, our own beliefs about what needs to occur that often causes us the most distress. But this use of time is what we do to define ourselves in physical life. And it imposes and insists value on what we do. So in the human experience, we have to meet deadlines, cooperate in such a way that encourages a functional society. The body has limitations on when it can get pregnant or what it might be able to do. But if we're truly seeking happiness, we have to commit to number one, honor peace. If you want peace, honor it. If you're not feeling peaceful, you need to work through that. Don't just gloss over it and get frustrated and angry because you don't have peace. Examine, go inward. Learn to be peaceful. 2, embrace surrender. We think we're in control. We aren't. Maybe we can control what we buy at the grocery store. Even sometimes that's not possible if they don't have an item in stock. But we have to learn how to separate from that which causes us disappointment and get back into a flow of greater reality, that there's something else, a different way to approach, is a different way to see things. And we all have to develop a mechanism that allows us to surrender when life happens. 3, we need to eradicate resistance from our response pattern. If we're feeling something crappy and we don't like it, that's too bad. We got to feel the crappy thing and be with it until we can release it. But most of us don't want to be with ourselves. We don't want to be with the feelings that come to us. So we go into resistance and try and talk our way out of it with our brilliant minds. But we have to develop the discipline to stop resisting life that we don't like. We have to train ourselves to accept each moment with gratitude and appreciation. It's our job to mine the gold from each experience and see each moment as divine food, that we couldn't be given something if we didn't need it. The divine is not inefficient. So how do we understand what the beauty is in the moment we are in, even if it's not what we asked for or what we wanted? If we allow our moments to be what they are without judgment, we expand ourselves. We become more magnetic. We put down the fences and start to allow life to work through us and for us, rather than working against life. We're not on our way to somewhere or trying to achieve anything in life. We are existing and expanding ourselves through experience. So each experience has something for us. We are already where we need to be in each moment. And when we consent to this truth about the greater reality and being in a body on this planet, the only experience we can have or create is one of abundance. And of course, time imposes judgments such as, am I too old? Am I too young? Am I too fat? Am I too thin? Are my grades good enough? Do I have enough time? Am I rushed? Is there enough time in the day? But each of us sets the rhythm and momentum of our life. We choose where to place our attention and how to spend our energy. When time is the master, we relinquish our power to create or experience magnificence. We relinquish power and autonomy in our own world. Yes, life is a collaboration, but when we put up roadblocks through resistance, we give up our power. And the more we identify with past wounding or past programming as our truth, well, my parents said that I couldn't do this, or my teacher said I was no good at XYZ. We're living in the past. We're not allowing our present moment to determine our future. If we're waiting for good to arrive, we're living in future reality. But if we're in the present moment, unattached and unidentified with experiences because of judgment, wounding, suddenly time does become irrelevant. And we are simply observing expansion and participating in it actively. We focus on being present in the moment without judgment, identification, or attachment is where happiness lives. So I've said it many times, but I'm going to say it another way, that in this life, we're here to elevate and expand ourselves and greater reality. So what does that mean? It means that we are resolving, completing, adding to, enjoying, loving, and learning how to manage energy in any way that can be imagined so that we can exist in higher realms. You know, it's so common for people to say they want more happiness, more money, more love, and simply more of everything. But what's not common is for people to consent to the activities or practices that will cause them to be receivers for those things. Here's a very basic example. People come to me to help them increase their income and grow their businesses, and I will give them 3 to 5 specific to-do items. And these are necessary steps any business or person has to take to build or grow an income. Then the client doesn't do the steps. And then when I get into their reasons why they didn't do the steps, it's very similar to the story of Jessica, in that they often don't believe they deserve abundance, or they're afraid of success or failure. So they choose to do nothing and offer many reasons and excuses for why they aren't taking steps. That's the crux of the problem right there. So as we dissect this type of scenario, we can see that the individual has to heal from their low self-worth, and that action is itself abundant. So we tend to think abundance is only money, but every vibration we bring into greater balance allows us to receive more. Everything affects the whole. But we do have to do our part in the contribution/exchange relationship to greater reality to receive the good things we say we want. And this is the life. And when we raise our frequencies, we can enjoy more and more. But we have to consent to it. And it's our choice in each moment, whether we consent or deny abundance. We hear the statement that time is illusion and that the past, present, and future all exist at the same time, even though it is always now whenever we're speaking. When you read this book 10 minutes from now, it will still be now. And in this case, when you listen to this book 10 minutes, it will still be now. But the idea that time is illusory is difficult to grasp unless you have some belief that life goes on, or perhaps that reincarnation exists, or at the very least, that we're going somewhere from where we are now. So let's talk about reincarnation. Through time in a body, I have become more persuaded about the possibility of reincarnation, especially when I see child prodigies on TV or on YouTube who sing like a mature individual, even though they're 8 or 9 years old. You know, a knowing sets in that they had to have been accomplished in another time to step into that role at such a high level. You know, when they left the body in another incarnation, they may have said to themselves, I'm not going to forget all the work and development of this lifetime. I mean, that stands to reason that we pick up where we left off when we reincarnate. But there are also people who have been significant in my life, and I've had a sense of knowing from the moment I met them. A familiarity existed, that I was extraordinarily drawn to them more than other people. And although everything is in the now, in our energy centers, our chakras, we carry forward all the information from all the experiences we have ever had. So although something may have happened 5 years ago, 100 years ago, 300 years ago, if it wasn't resolved to the highest frequency, we'll be drawn to it. Or if we had a particular good experience with someone, we will recognize them energetically and be drawn to them. It may not be a conscious recognition, but we will move forward with them through some other rational explanation. I had an experience with a first love when I was 18, and the moment I laid eyes on him, I felt his presence. I had never been so drawn to a person. I just thought it was because he was cute. At least he was cute to me. We became involved in a passionate and intense love affair. And about a year into it, I began to learn and experience that he was quite deceptive and truly cruel. And he turned out to be the opposite of what I believed he was. And I was extremely devastated by the experience. Later, after a debilitating breakup, I happened upon a book called You Were Born Again to Be Together. This book gave me my first glimpse into the idea of reincarnation. And this book provided case studies that were very compelling. It was a completely new idea to me, but I was so stimulated by the idea, I wanted to experience past life regression personally. So I found a class in Berkeley, California, and began what would be a 16-week course in past life regression. Now, when I went through the past life regression course, I discovered a lifetime with my ex-boyfriend where he had been married, or excuse me, we had been married. And in that lifetime, he was very cruel and controlling, not too different than in the lifetime I met him in at that point. He would not even allow me to leave the house. I had a miserable life. We lived in a remote area. I was practically a prisoner. There was no transportation in that era. And in that lifetime, I had no options. In this lifetime, I was able to get away from him. Granted, I loved him and wanted our romance, but I did not want to resign myself to abuse or cruelty. When the cruelty began, I was able to extricate myself from it. So there was progress between lifetimes. I was able to come full circle on the grief of the experience. Now, this is a little bit different take on it, but during one of the regressions, a lot of emotion that was not present time came out of me. And that experience remains one of the most potent experiences I've ever had, because I processed present time grief and I processed past time grief. And this really allowed me to resolve a karmic connection to this situation or any that were familiar. So for this reason, I'm a huge supporter of past life regression. So whether or not you believe past lives exist, it's an amazing tool for clearing energy and expanding self-awareness. So although I was immediately drawn to my boyfriend, I only spent a year with him rather than a lifetime. And I learned enough from the previous incarnation and carried it forward to know I didn't want to go down that road again. Now, the following story provides a way to consider future in present time. I had a client whose parent was a Holocaust survivor. He carried forward anger, pain, and distrust from that experience. He was never able to separate from that experience to learn to be joyful. Consequently, he raised his children with an iron hand. He was truly a tyrant. He literally terrorized and bullied his kids. And as they became adults, none of them wanted to be with him. They were completely uninterested. But when they came of age, they couldn't wait to get away from him. The father was unable to see the connection of how being a bully and tyrant created a situation where his children didn't want to be with him. All he could see was the pain of his own experience. He felt justified in everything he did. He was unwilling and unable to see any connection between his treatment of his kids in the past and how it influenced his present moment and ultimately his future. His explanation for his adult children's behavior is that they were stupid, useless, and awful kids. So a person with this identification is stuck on the pattern they're in. And that's a past pattern. And they refuse to consider any other possibility for many reasons. And they shift responsibility onto others for why they are unloved or unhappy. So this represents an example of how that fixation looks in the continuum of past, present, future, eternal now reality. The eternal now is the center of the universe where divine intelligence exists. It is where enlightened entities live at all times. It is where each of us strive to go and remain when we get there. Enlightened beings like Jesus, Buddha, Paramhansa Yogananda live here. The average person like you or me may be inching our way toward that ultimate reality, but we're not there yet. We're still expanding. Those enlightened masters live the eternal now, even in human form, and they come to us to show us how to do it. And through right thinking, meditation, personal responsibility, and joy, we all keep inching toward the center that is the eternal now. And every step we take toward that center cultivates an expanded awareness, and it moves us closer to that awakened and enlightened state where peacefulness and happiness are the natural states of being. When the soul takes a body, we choose a family, a personality, and align with those people who help us realize our spiritual goals. But when we take a body, we activate our ego. We need the ego to survive the human experience. But to the degree we identify with life through the lens of the ego will determine the extent of our joy or lack of joy. And there's a graphic in the book that I can't describe to you necessarily, but it really does show the continuum of behavior, emotions, identifications, and how they all create a perfect circle of past, present, future. So when we choose to take a human body, we automatically slip into an egoic perspective and begin to identify with physical experiences. We have to survive physically, yet still understand that the physical experience is the ultimate illusion, while ultimate truth resides in non-physical. And depending upon where we're born on the planet and the family we come into on the planet, that journey to that reality will be easy, difficult, confusing, or not confusing. Because we all bring in our karma with us as well. And where we ended the last lifetime is where we pick up on an evolutionary standard. So that explains why some people come into horrific experiences, but they'll be some of the most beautiful people. Or other people stay in a horrific experience and their life continues to be such. Experience is a teacher, a mechanism for growth. And the more we understand that once we garner the value from the experience we're in, we evolve, and the pain, the hardship, whatever came through that physical experience just drops away, falls away. The father of a dear friend of mine, although quite intelligent, spent all his time waiting for moments in which he could relive instances when he felt superior or in the right about something. And no matter how much time passed between an event or the present moment, if he could find a way to bring up a situation from the past and talk about how right he had been in that situation, he would do it. He loved to do that. And his entire existence and validation to himself revolved around being right. Well, one day I asked him if he ever wanted to learn and grow from his experiences and understand what they all meant. And as quickly as I got the words out, he barked back emphatically, no. His identification, his value, and his perception of life was at its best, reliving those moments when he was right. He didn't ever want to relinquish those stories or stop telling them over and over. Why would he? These memories were his source of happiness. He knew no other way to find happiness and did not want to learn another way at this point. And the idea was far too threatening to the world he had created for himself. From his perspective, his reality, his happiness is what he has. He doesn't long for anything different. So when we're fixed on an idea, we don't see around the speck we're focused on. And our attention, just like my friend's father, was to stay right on the target, the dot. It was to hold on to that one place in time in which he found a moment of satisfaction. You know, imagine you're holding a dark object close in front of your eyes, and all you can see is dark. And you would swear to everyone around you, the world is dark, life is dark, dark is all there is. And you would assert that perspective staunchly. But as soon as you move the dark object away from your eyes and give a little space, your perspective would change. You would see something differently. So we become aware there's much more going on than what we originally considered when we allow space in, when we move, put some distance between the things we hold so dear and are attached to. And the ability to expand our perspective, to see as many angles as we possibly can, is one of the paths to enlightenment. And this is the process of developing an expanded consciousness. And each time we take in expansion, it brings us closer to that unending happiness and voiding discomfort. Because the soul is content with all experiences. It's the physical body that wants to resist.